I'm Councillor Paul Hodgkinson. I represent the County Council division of Bolton-on-the-Water and Northleach for the Lib Dems, and I'm also the Parliamentary spokesperson for the Cotswolds. There's lots of reasons. I mean, first of all, the risks associated with fracking, that's in the top of my mind. If you go back to 2014, when the then government started issuing licenses for fracking, as we know, in the north of England, that resulted in a mini earthquake. And then fracking was very rapidly stopped in the light of protests and that event. So that's the first thing on my mind, is that actually I'm really disturbed that the new government, as it's called, is suddenly deciding to put that aside, which was actually a part of their manifesto in 2019, that they would not go ahead with fracking unless the risks were seen to be eliminated, which to my mind haven't been. That's the first issue. The second issue is about consent. So in other words, local people have not consented suddenly to be interested in or accepting fracking. Far from it. And then the third issue, I guess, is the blot on the landscape. In other words, you know, you're talking about drilling. And if that happened in an area like the Cotswolds, you are effectively talking about big drilling mechanisms in what is the area of outstanding natural beauty. So you've got a whole series of things going on, which I think are very worrying. Yeah, I mean, obviously every renewable or different type of energy has to have a mechanism for getting that energy. So wind turbines are a little more controversial insofar as they are very visible. However, having seen them in Cornwall, the Lake District, you know, they're proliferated there. Actually, they're not really, I don't see them as a scar on the landscape. My sort of point, though, around this would be, as an advocate of renewable energy, is that you don't, everyone goes back to wind turbines and says, oh, what about that as a blot on the landscape? But what about all the rest? Solar power is a case in point. We've just had the hottest temperature on record this summer. We've had lots of sun this year, lots of dry weather. I know people who've got solar panels, or people who've got large scale solar panels who've made a lot of not just money, but putting stuff back into the grid this summer. So I'm a big advocate of solar power. And I think, that isn't a blot on the landscape. Actually, you can do it in a way which is quite creative. You can have solar panels with actually nurseries underneath where plants are growing. So there's ways and means of doing that. And also, of course, the west of England, not necessarily the Cotswolds, but certainly the coast, has got lots of wind. So there's massive capacity there, and massive opportunities for offshore wind power and tidal too. Well, again, if you go back to when when fracking was first mooted in the sort of 2013-14 time, the Cotswolds was identified as one of those places where there were or are reserves of shale gas. So if you look at there's a map being created, and the Cotswolds is part of that. So that's why the Cotswolds has risen up the agenda on this, because certainly and I know other people, are concerned that because there are these reserves, natural reserves of shale gas in some parts of the Cotswolds, therefore the door could be opened. And in fact, the Cotswolds Conservative MP, Geoffrey Clifton Brown, just last week was saying that he wasn't opposed to fracking in the Cotswolds, and that people could be compensated financially for it, which I thought was pretty rich, to be honest with you. And I know that in itself has caused concerns. So that's why the Cotswolds is seen as being potentially in the firing line. It's going to be tricky, isn't it? I think that, I mean, anyone trying to sell fracking at the moment is on a sticky wicket. I mean, I've had people challenging me and saying, well, they're using it a lot in the USA. Okay, but on our doorstep in the rest of Europe, they're not. And there's, you know, most countries in Europe are very adamant that they will not advance it at all until the risks have been eliminated. And there are risks which have emerged in America. So, you know, I think it's, we've seen this with what's the so-called new government of Liz Truss and co, is that they're floating stuff suddenly from nowhere, pushing it out there, getting a really bad reaction. We've already seen today there's been a U-turn on tax rates. It wouldn't surprise me if there was a U-turn on this too, because as you rightly point out, local consent is going to be very difficult to come by. And unless you're actually drilling in an area where you're many, many miles away from people, many miles, you know, where the risk of a mini earthquake or whatever, therefore is limited because the population is nowhere near the drilling point. Unless that's the case, you're always going to have people who are concerned. The main risk is as I've outlined before, is of earth tremors, earthquakes. So as I said, in the north of England, when one of the very few fracking attempts was made in about 8 years ago now, there was a mini earthquake. And this was talked about before that happened, that this has happened in other places, including America. And so therefore, when you're actually doing the fracking process, you're drilling, there is a risk of that happening because of the way fracking works. And that's bound to be an issue, isn't it? It's bound to be. And that to me is the biggest risk. The other risk, I guess, is the sheer scale of drilling that would need to take place. And as I say, unless you're miles and miles from anyone else or the population, it's going to be very, very big. It's a big blot on the landscape. And so it's a really big thing if an area is called an area of outstanding natural beauty, like the Cotswolds is. We've got to push renewables right up. I mean, we're making progress on that as a country. It started in the coalition years, and it's really progressed a lot. But I'm a big fan of solar, and I think we can do so much more with that. As I say, there are people locally in the Cotswolds who are using solar now much more. Individuals in their houses, there are community energy initiatives starting up in villages and communities where people are pooling together using solar power. And I think that has to be really, really pushed up higher. I think Cotswold District Council, for instance, which is run by the Lib Dems, is proposing to invest in solar farms as well, which is very interesting. So I'm a big fan of that. I'm also a big fan of tidal power, offshore wind in particular, because I think, you know, we are, as an island surrounded by sea, we get a lot of wind coming in from the west. Let's use it. Let's harness that. That's really where the future lies, I think. And yes, of course, the war in Ukraine has affected gas prices in particular. But we don't know how long that's going to go on for. And actually, and we hope it does, if it resolves itself positively, then actually the gas prices might start coming down again. But we'll see. We'll wait for that. The key, though, is renewable, because that's not only the key in terms of green energy, but also it's as a country, we can make much more use of that.